Good day. This program today is again going to be about the crisis in Ukraine, which is increasingly becoming the central element in the world crisis. I say world crisis because now it's clear that the economic consequences of this crisis caused by the sanctions war are intensifying and accelerating. We've had a shock fall in US GDP. Now this has been explained away by various experts. People say that underlying demand remains strong, and that this looks like some sort of aberration. A curious statement, which I think requires more deep analysis in a more extensive program. But at the same time, we now have further articles appearing elsewhere across the media. The Financial Times, for example, today is leading with a report, as I write, that stagflation has now arrived in the Eurozone. In other words, that the Eurozone economies are now facing a combination of recession and surging inflation. And of course, this is going to be the story all around the world as prices for practically all commodities, food, energy, metals, other raw materials, go on increasing. And yet, there still seems to be no ability or willingness to fully get off the sanctions escalator. A few days ago, Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of State, warned the European Union against oil sanctions on Russia. She said all that would do would be to raise oil prices. Russia would probably be able to make up the difference by selling oil at higher prices, even if at reduced volumes, to various third parties. But in the meantime, it would hit and damage the European economy in some form. And yet, it seems that the Europeans are not listening to the advice of no less a person than the US Secretary of State, and are still looking for some way to impose what would in effect be an embargo on themselves, denying themselves the option of cheaper Russian pipeline oil. We're told that this will take time, that this will be a phased thing, but merely discussing restrictions on oil supplies from Russia is itself going to increase oil prices, a fact which it seems no one in a position of authority within the European Union wants to understand or see through. And in the meantime, the European Union, at least the Commission, continues to try to find ways to block European companies which are now moving steadily towards coming to agreements with the Russians on the gas for rubles deal. Yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, warned or asked European governments and European companies not to agree to the proposal for gas for rubles, this complicated proposal which I've discussed at length in previous programs. This after reports began to circulate that more and more European companies are intent on complying with the proposal because they see no alternative to doing so. Then a few hours later, no less a person than the spokesperson of the European Commission actually contradicted the EU Commission's own legal advice by saying that the procedure that had been set up by the Russians for payments in euros to Gazprom Bank, with Gazprom Bank then converting the money into rubles, paying it into corresponding accounts for EU energy companies, and then paying forwarding the rubles to Gazprom. Anyway, the spokesman of the European Commission, contradicting the EU's own advice that this mechanism was sanctions compliant, made a statement to the effect that it would violate sanctions. That, of course, leaves European companies in a kind of legal limbo. They're very uncertain what to do. They've been apparently busy advising European governments that there simply aren't alternative supplies of gas to be found, and the indications at the moment is that they're still working with the support of their governments to find some kind of way to comply with this gas for rubles procedure that the Russians have outlined. But the very fact that there are people in the European Commission who are trying to block this mechanism, risking a cut-off of gas from Russia to Europe when there are no alternative supplies that can be found which could plug the gaps, shows the extent of the hysteria, I would almost call it madness, which has taken hold, and the incredible difficulties some governments, some people find in getting off this sanctions escalator, even as the European economy descends into recession, and even as prices across the Europe and, of course, the whole collective West continue to surge. Meanwhile, we're getting other really bizarre decisions being made by all sorts of Western governments of a kind that I find difficult to understand. Firstly, the US Congress has now passed a Lend-Lease bill to supply Ukraine with weapon systems out of US stocks. Now, all I would say about that is that Lend-Lease is by definition a system of the United States providing loans to Ukraine in order to buy weapon systems from the United States. Now, this was a project that was devised by the United States during the Second World War in order to supply weapons to its allies, the Soviet Union and Britain. And of course, the important point to grasp is that these were loans which the Soviet Union and Britain then had to repay when the war was over. Well, Britain and the Soviet Union did eventually repay these loans. In the British case, the loans had to be renegotiated by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, but the British eventually paid them off in 2006, and the Soviets also, and then the Russians, also finally cleared their loans, their wartime loans, to the United States in the same year, which is to say in 2006. This is a mechanism for trapping Ukraine, or what's left of it, in perpetual debt. It's not obvious to me how that's going to help Ukraine, and one would have thought that a negotiation and a settlement of the crisis would be a better way of helping Ukraine. But there we are. That's what they intend to do. People in the United States lend money to Ukraine, which is already bankrupt, whose economy is collapsing, and then hope that at some point in the future, Ukraine will be able to pay this money off. In the meantime, President Biden has come along and has asked Congress to authorize $33 billion of aid to Ukraine. This would be an amount equivalent to a fifth of Ukraine's annual GDP. I should say pre-war annual GDP, because according to various figures, which some people are floating around, that GDP has now halved. Now, it seems to me that it is fundamentally illogical for the United States at one and the same time asking the Ukraine to borrow money from the United States in order to buy weapon systems in the United States, and at the same time shoveling money in this vast amount towards Ukraine. But what it does show is that effectively it is the United States now that is bankrolling Ukraine. It's keeping Ukraine afloat. Now, this has happened before. It happened with Vietnam, South Vietnam, during the war there. It happened to a certain extent with Iraq after its occupation. And it happened with Afghanistan to the price of, well, some people say up to $1 trillion. Didn't end very well in any one of these cases. Why does anybody think it's going to end any better with Ukraine? Why does anybody suppose that this is going to make the slightest difference to the military situation? Anyway, In the meantime, what it's going to do is it's going to increase the profits of certain arms manufacturers in the United States. It's going to increase the US federal deficit at a time when the deficit is surging. It's also going to mean, if there's going to be renewed arms production in the United States, both to increase supply of weapon systems to the US military, but also to fulfill what is now starting to look like a bottomless pit in Ukraine. Well, if that also happens, then it seems to me that the US trade deficit, which is now also at record levels, is also going to start growing. And coming back to the point about the GDP contraction, if GDP contracts, if output falls, if output is being diverted to weapons productions, even as demand continues to be artificially, or at least in some form, sustained in the United States, the only outcome of that is going to be higher inflation, which is, of course, exactly what happened during the period of the Vietnam War and its aftermath. But there we are. We have these strange, eccentric decisions. We have extraordinary statements by people like Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, talking about how this war must end in Russia's total defeat, something which Liz Truss does not explain how she's going to be able to achieve. But anyway, that's her policy. And it is widely accepted in Britain, by the way, that this policy that Liz Truss is outlining is in fact nothing more than a pitch for the Conservative leadership and for the Premiership when, as now seems inevitable, Boris Johnson is forced to resign. Boris Johnson being, of course, in deep political trouble in Britain itself. So here we see a whole succession of increasingly eccentric and strange decisions being taken by Western leaders as they become intoxicated by the moment, but also as they sense increasingly that their political reputations and perhaps the credibility of the West is now invested in achieving some kind of positive outcome in Ukraine. What that positive outcome is or is meant to be, I don't think anybody has really explained clearly, apart, of course, from Liz Truss, who's explained it in an entirely utopian and eccentric way. All I would say is that I'm already reading in some realist websites like Responsible Statecraft, people asking the question of how exactly it is that Western leaders expect this war in Ukraine to end, what their end game, their actual end game for this war is. I suspect that if you get all these Western leaders, in a corner and ask them that question directly, they will not be able to come up with an answer because at the moment none of them are thinking that far. For my part, I will say what I think the eventual outcome will be. It will be the complete destruction of Ukraine. And that brings me now to the next part of my program, because we're getting more and more news from the battlefront. And it seems that the Russians, or at least the Allied forces allied to Russia, are now pressing ever closer to Slavyansk, which is part of the remaining Slavyansk-Kramatorsk area, where the Ukrainian military in Donetsk seems to be concentrating as it tries to hold on to at least some kind of presence in Donbass. Now, I've already said that I think the best and correct thing to do would be for the Ukrainians to pull their troops out of Donbass. But with all this talk of victory in the West, with all these demands in Ukraine itself that Ukraine defend every inch of its territory, even those parts of its territory that don't want to be defended, and which would rather presumably join with Russia, or at least the Donbass republics, it seems that these troops in Donbass, these Ukrainian troops, are being condemned to stay there, to fight heroic and pointless last stands in places like Severodonetsk, where they're now under close siege, and of course, before very long, in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And all of this is coming with videos which I am not going to provide links to, or photos which I'm not going to provide links to, which show enormous Ukrainian casualties. They show pictures of dead Ukrainian soldiers, some of which are extremely distressing, and which upset me when I consider that these terrible pictures of these people show actually dead young men, some of them, by the way, not so young anymore, and it shows them in really horrible conditions of death in many cases. And I remember to myself, I say to myself, these are somebody's father, brother, husband, son. And it's really distressing to see. It's also perhaps rather less distressing. It might even in some respects be encouraging to see, but it would be presumably alarming for Ukraine that there are also increasing numbers of pictures of more and more Ukrainian soldiers, sometimes in large groups, giving up and surrendering. And I have to say, it does look as if the situation in Donbass is indeed becoming critical. There's reports that in fact, I can say that there are more than reports. The Ukrainian army has now mined one of the bridges leading into the town of Slavyansk, suggesting that they expect the Russians to arrive there very soon. There's rumors that that the Russians are indeed very close to Slavyansk, and that their forward reconnaissance units are already essentially at the outskirts of the city, though their main forces have yet to be deployed there. But anyway, there's pictures that show that, and I do wonder whether in fact the Ukrainians have any kind of real plan. There was talk some days ago of some kind of pullback from Severodonetsk, but that hasn't happened. There's talk today of a Ukrainian pullback from Slavyansk to the largest town of Kramatorsk, which is further south. At the moment, no sign of that either, unless the intended demolition of this bridge is supposed to slow the Russians down, to allow the Ukrainian troops more time to escape from Slavyansk. Well, who knows? But anyway, it doesn't look particularly good one way or the other. And I can't help but think that all talk of retreats or withdrawals from Donbass are going to face impossible political resistance, not just in Kiev, but disastrously from Western governments as well. And even as this is happening, I've now obtained further clarity about that very strange reference to 1940 that was made by Sergei Volin, the commander of Volina rather, who was the commander or claimed commander of the Ukrainian troops trapped in the Azovstal factory. When I read his latest video comment yesterday in the program I did yesterday, I did so on the basis of an article that appeared in the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph did not report his entire words, and it's not, now that I've seen them in full, difficult to understand why. Because in reference to 1940, this is what Volina said. I appealed to all world leaders, I appealed to lead diplomats, I appealed to Pope Francis I, yelled as much as I could for us to be heard and extraction procedures to be used on us. Many do not understand what is this procedure. I want to give an example of the rescue operation of 1940 during the Second World War, with Britain and France in the main roles. During hostilities, they ended up on a French shore. He's referring, by the way, to Dunkirk. I'm not going to discuss his apparently difficult ideas of geography or indeed of military affairs. The German troops fully surrounded them, and there was a direct order from Hitler to stop and not to destroy them fully, which gave an option to avoid a catastrophe for Allied states and complete the evacuation. During evacuation, over 300,000 people were rescued. The rescue operation was carried out with everything that was available: boats, ships, civilian vessels, fishing boats. Both military and civilians were saving people, and also various organizations and people who simply cared enough. My main appeal for today: save the Mariupol garrison. Conduct the extraction procedure for us. Today is not 1940, today is 2022. And then there's a lot more. Well, all I will say is that this is a fantastic proposal. I mean, one has to have some sympathy for Commander Volina, who is no doubt, as I said, disconnected from information and from much understanding of realities. Perhaps it's not surprising that he's coming up with proposals like this, but it really needs to be reiterated again that this is a fantastic proposal. What he is asking for is a major Western military operation to try to evacuate these Ukrainian troops from the Azovstal factory in the face of Russian opposition, military opposition. That is, of course, what happened during the evacuation from Dunkirk. There is absolutely no possibility whatsoever, none at all, of this being done to extract the garrison in Mariupol. The fact that he is talking in this extraordinary way shows, as I said, how completely out of touch with reality he is. Moreover, it seems that the Russian troops are now closing in on the last remnants of resistance in Azovstal. They're producing more and more pictures of the Azovstal factory. They seem to suggest that the northern part of the factory is indeed under their control, the part of the factory that consisted of cement works. They show Russian and Allied troops very close to some of these underground bunkers where these Ukrainian troops are and civilians are believed to be. They've even identified the bunker where they think the command center of the Ukrainian forces is located. It's all suggests that despite Putin's apparent stop order of a few days ago, the reality is that incrementally and steadily, the Russians and their allied forces are now closing fast on these remaining Ukrainian troops in Azovstal. I would add, by the way, that we've also had more reports about the nature of the supply situation within Azovstal. There are reports on the Russian side that the Ukrainian troops in Azovstal do have enough water to keep going, but that their food supplies are now down to 9 days, which would appear to provide an absolute limit to the extent to which they can continue resisting. There are other reports from the Russian side of the battle which suggest that the Russians might in fact be preparing to storm some of these bunkers within the next few days. I'm not going to speculate about this. The US and the British have, however, in the meantime reported that increasingly large numbers of units, Russian and Allied units, have been withdrawn from Mariupol and are heading north to participate in the fighting there. So that's the situation in Mariupol, in Azovstal. A commander who has clearly lost any grasp of reality, who, to my way of thinking, is clearly no longer fit to command. If one is coming up with fantastic proposals like this, then frankly the correct thing for the authorities in Kiev to do would be to relieve him of his command, because the proposals that he's making are, to be straightforward about it, so far-fetched as to be all but nonsensical. And I have to say that I am not surprised that the Daily Telegraph decided to exclude this passage from its report of Commander Valina's words. Obviously, in Britain, the events of Dunkirk are extremely well known, especially, by the way, by the sort of people who read the Daily Telegraph. And I suspect that if many of them were aware of Commander Valina's comments, his full comments, comparing his predicament and that of his soldiers to the predicament of the British Army in Dunkirk, many people in Britain who still support the war and who still believe that Ukraine is fighting well, or it might even win, I think their faith would be severely shaken by if they were to see the full extent of what Commander Valina said. Anyway, it's not just in Donbass and it's not just in Mariupol that things seem to be going badly for Ukraine. The Ukrainians appear to accept that they have been losing ground in Kharkiv region. There's reports today that the Russians have captured a village close to Kharkiv itself, Kharkiv city. It may suggest that at some point some kind of advance on Kharkiv city might actually happen. And the Russians have also reported that they have now fully cleared Kherson region of all remaining Ukrainian forces there. And before I proceed, I'm going to make one quick observation here, and this is related to something that was said by the blogger known as Bernhardt, who writes the blog known as The Moon of Alabama, and who has a background apparently in the German military. By his own account, he was a tank officer in the German Bundeswehr, and therefore he obviously has a grasp of military affairs, which, to be straightforward about it, is well beyond mine. But he has made a point which I found extremely interesting and which I openly admit had never occurred to me, that the original Russian moves around Kiev, which attracted so much attention at the start of the war, their major purpose was not so much to force the Ukrainian government into negotiations, though I still believe that that was one of its multiple purposes. But it was to pin Ukrainian troops down in a defense of Kiev. That I have always acknowledged and believed myself to have been the case. But the main purpose was not to cause the relocation of Ukrainian troops from Donbass. It was to prevent Ukraine from reinforcing its forces in the south in places like Kherson and Zaporozhye. And it was this pressure on Kiev that enabled the Russians to capture most of Kherson and Zaporozhye region so quickly. And of course, capturing this territory, this belt of territory, enabled the encirclement of Mariupol, stabilized the situation in Crimea, and of course has tightened the trap around the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. I want to take this opportunity to say that I think Bernhard is right. I think this was probably one of the main purposes of that Russian move on Kiev, that Russian diversion in and around Kiev. And if one looks at the situation, one has to conclude that he was spectacularly successful. So all of these Western military aid that's been funneled to Ukraine isn't really changing the situation on the ground to any degree. There still seems to be some hope that something can be patched together. But it's clear that Ukraine is running out of weapon systems at a phenomenal rate, even with the $33 billion, of which $20 billion, by the way, has been assigned to defense and security matters, and of which, as far as I can tell, only $5 billion is going to be allocated to weapons supplies. Even with all of that, it seems that the United States is struggling to keep up with Ukrainian demands and may not be able to do so. And there was an extraordinary comment by the head of Raytheon, the CEO of Raytheon, who said that the United States, having now run down to dangerously critical levels its supplies of Stinger missiles, Stinger Manpads missiles, it's going to take it a long time to restart production, because these missiles haven't been made in the United States for around 18 years, and many of the materials needed to make them are no longer available, and that restarting production is going to take time. And I suspect we're going to see this right through the industrial supply chains. And of course, the sanctions wars and the collapse of supply chains, which I discussed at the start of this program, well, all that's going to make it even more complicated. And it's going to increase the costs, and it's going to increase the inflation as well. Meanwhile, the Russian military continue to be busy on other fronts. They continue to launch missile strikes all across Ukraine at ever higher tempos. Yesterday, they launched missile strikes on Kiev, on industrial facilities in Kiev. They have not yet struck at command centers in Kiev, but already the mere threat of doing so seems to have had an effect, because we're getting reports that Western intelligence agencies have told the Ukrainian officials in Kiev, and perhaps more importantly, Ukrainian military leaders in Kiev, to avoid using their usual command posts and governmental centers, because the Russians know where they are and could strike them at any time. And we've been hearing reports that some new command center with Americans has been set up in Lviv, and I suspect that that's where the real operational direction of the Ukrainian side of the war is taking place from. I would say this is high risk. The Russians have already made it clear that as far as they're concerned, any military facility on the territory of Ukraine is a target, and they've also made it clear that any Western military people who find themselves in this target should not assume that simply because they are there, the Russians will forbear from striking it. And yesterday, the Russians launched their missile strikes on Kiev, even though the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and the Bulgarian Prime Minister were both in Kiev, and I suspect this was intended in part to emphasize, to underline that point. Whilst I'm on the subject of Mr. Guterres, it should be said that he seems to be now trying to arrange for the evacuation of the civilians from the Azovstal factory. Now, there's been some discussion as to what this evacuation means, and there's been some suggestions that the evacuation would not just be of the civilians there, but of the Ukrainian soldiers there. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has flatly rejected any such idea. TASS reports Peskov as saying the following: the president, in other words, Mr. Putin, made it quite clear civilians can exit and go anywhere they please. Militants must lay down their arms and exit as well. Their lives will be preserved. All injured and sick will be provided with medical aid. What's there to negotiate about in this case? In other words, the civilians can go. They're free to go wherever they please. All that needs to be agreed is for them to be allowed to leave the bunkers and to evacuate to Kiev or wherever they wish to go. But the soldiers, the armed men in Azovstal, the people who've been fighting, they must lay down their arms and surrender and accept being taken as prisoners of war. And I mean, this is quite clear. I don't think there's any possibility of the Russians changing their position on this. Well, yesterday, alongside all of these various developments in the war in Donbass, we also got more and more of a trickle of reports from all sorts of people in the West, supporters of Ukraine, all of which seem to be admitting that the picture in Ukraine is turning bleak for the Ukrainian military. I'm not going to embarrass these people by reading out their statements. All I will say is this: the British Defence Ministry, which has generally taken a very upbeat, in fact, taken an extremely upbeat perspective of Ukraine's prospects in the war, also released a report in which they said that the Russians are making steady incremental advances, small incremental advances, though this comes at a high cost to them. Now, that's a cack-handed way of admitting that the Russians are making advances. So even the British are finding it difficult to spin the situation in Ukraine in optimistic terms. And in fact, it's some time now since I read articles in the British media about Ukrainian victories or Ukrainian advances. On the contrary, all the indications are of the Ukraine's being pushed back in every part of the front, and as I said, of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration facing now increasing and intensifying pressure. So I come back to my point earlier in this program. We are now looking at a global economic crisis. We're looking at stagflation. We've already had the first readout pointing to a contraction of US GDP. The Financial Times talks about a stagflation in the Eurozone. Elsewhere around the world, we're getting more and more reports about how the rise in food prices is a catastrophe for people across the global south. Surely the penny is going to drop at some point. That victory in Ukraine against Russia is unachievable. All the indications point, on the contrary, to eventual Ukrainian defeat. Not just in Ukraine's interests, but in that of the West, and dare I say it, all humanity that is now facing an economic crisis. Surely the right thing to do is to look for some way to negotiate peace. Now, this seems to me so obvious that I find myself becoming deeply frustrated at the inability of Western leaders to grasp and understand this. I have to say that does seem to be the position at the moment. I was listening to President Biden's incredibly muddled address yesterday. Parts of it have already been parodied, where he appeared to lose his thread at various points, the kind of things that President Biden increasingly does. To be frank, he comes across to me increasingly as an obsessive old man who, conscious that everything else that he's doing as president is failing, is now increasingly focusing on this one issue, the war in Ukraine, in which he has become dangerously emotionally invested. And in Europe, especially in Germany, I get the sense that the same thing is at play, that the Germans have become intoxicated, as so often happens to them, by some great idealistic adventure. The Germans are always easy to manipulate through their idealism, even when that idealism, when analysed properly, turns out to be not just misinformed, but fundamentally corrupt. And they don't seem to be able to pull back, even in their own interests. And of course, the British have their own obsessions, which are also leading them further and closer to disaster. But of course, the people who are acting in the most deluded way of all seem to be the people who are closest to the war, who you might have expected would act most rationally and would be anxious to try to distance themselves from the war and to insulate themselves from the war as much as possible. Now, a couple of days ago, we were hearing reports about an attempt to destabilize the situation in Transnistria. I personally have no doubt that the Russians were not involved in this, and all the indications are, including statements made by high officials in Ukraine, that some of these attacks that took place in Transnistria were organized from Ukraine. I don't know that for a fact, but I would be astonished were it otherwise. Anyway, the Moldovan government, pro-Western as it is, seems to understand what a complete disaster it would be for Moldova if it was sucked into a war. The president of Moldova, Ms. Sandu, has come out and said that she's desperate to keep Moldova out of the war, that there's no military solution to the Transnistria crisis, that Moldova doesn't have effective armed forces. And she has specifically and categorically rejected any suggestion that Romanian troops are either in Moldova or will be allowed to enter Moldova to participate in an attack on Transnistria. Whether Ms. Sandu is telling the truth, whether she's able to hold the line, I wonder. But anyway, that is what she's saying. And there does seem to have been a slight easing of tensions in Transnistria over the last few hours, though I would say the situation looks very unstable. But at least if there are voices of reason in Moldova, and to some extent, by the way, also in Romania as well, that doesn't look to be the case further north. Yesterday, the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, published a report which said that the Poles are considering, the Polish government is considering sending a force into western Ukraine, a peacekeeping force, purportedly, but one has to suspect an annexation force over what was ultimately historic Polish territory eventually. Anyway, that was what the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, said. I've not seen any strong denials from Warsaw. On the contrary, what we're getting are reports of large Polish exercises being timed for May, all of which appear to give credence to this report by the SVR. And I would say that I've come to the clear view that President Putin's statement, he's warning the other day of lightning strikes on any NATO force that enters Ukraine. The warning that he gave during that address in St. Petersburg in the building of the former Imperial State Duma was intended first and foremost as a warning to Poland. I think there's been a lot of speculation about whether Russia and Poland might quietly, between each other, agree to some kind of carve-up of Ukraine, whereby Russia takes control of eastern Ukraine and the Ukraine's Black Sea coast. Poland is allowed to reoccupy western Ukraine, and a kind of rump Ukraine around Kiev is left with some kind of puppet government controlled from Moscow. Well, I've seen no evidence of any discussion by the Russians and the Poles for that kind of partition of Ukraine in that way, which would be, by the way, extremely cynical exercise if it were to happen. But all I would say is that Putin's comments in St. Petersburg suggest that far from the Russians seeing a Polish move into western Ukraine as something that they might welcome, on the contrary, they would interpret it as a dangerous and very hostile act and would be prepared to respond with overwhelming power against it. And when Putin used the expression lightning strikes against these, or rather, lightning action against these forces, I think what he clearly was referring to, by the way, was Russia's increasing and increasingly powerful arsenal of hypersonic missiles. So I think this is what Putin was trying to warn the Poles against doing. Unfortunately, listening at the kind of comments and actions that the Polish government is taking, I don't think they're paying much attention. Either they think the Russians are bluffing, or, which is perhaps more dangerous, They believe that if they do advance into Western Ukraine, they will have the backing of the other Western powers if they do it, and that they will have some kind of protection from the Western powers if Russian hypersonic missiles are unleashed upon them. If we get into that kind of situation, then we will be in a huge crisis. Because to be straightforward about it, I don't think at that point Western powers, especially people in the United States, would be willing to come to Poland's help. And it's difficult to know what in that case the Poles themselves would do. But anyway, that does seem to be the direction that events are taking. And these inflammatory comments from people like Liz Truss, these extraordinary statements by people like President Biden, by some of the political leaders in Germany, are not helping the situation. They're escalating it. They're causing it to become more dangerous. They're encouraging politicians like Deputy Prime Minister Jarosław Kaczynski, who is a person with various issues, and I would even say complexes about Russia that go back to his childhood and his experiences under communist rule in Poland, and also which are undoubtedly connected to the death of his brother. Well, his ideas don't seem to be getting the kind of restraint and check that they should. Well, on that rather ominous note, I'm going to leave you today. I hope that the situation does stabilize over the next few weeks. I hope that people do draw back. I hope that the inevitable defeat of the Ukrainian army in Donbass will finally concentrate minds. I hope also that the deepening economic problems in the West will concentrate minds too. I'm afraid I see little sign of this, and it seems to me that all the indications are that the world crisis is not only going to continue, but is soon going to become far more dangerous. Well, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. Remember, you can find us now on various platforms. If you check us out on Rumble, you'll find our videos there. And if you see one of our videos, if you press the red maroon button at the top, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage. And if, of course, you join us on Locals and choose to participate on Locals, well, in that case, you can very quickly become an active member, participate in my Wednesday live streams, publish your own exclusive content, comment on the threads of the various exclusive articles that you see there. And by the way, I'm also now starting to publish videos on various issues which are exclusive to Locals as well. And also, you can support us or support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And also, you can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And of course, don't forget, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's enough for me today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.